Okay, we're going to start off tonight in Galatians chapter 5. This time we're going to go after verse 6. I think we finished last time on verse 5. And this time we'll just start right back up on verse 6. Verse 6, if you remember verse 5, we spent a lot of time on this one particular verse. For through the Spirit, by faith, are waiting for the hope of righteousness, and how powerful that was, and how Luther really spent a lot of time on that and had some really great insights. And then we go into verse 6, which is very interesting. For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything. And to be honest with you, this particular phrase, this first half of the verse, is not remarkable in light of the last two chapters. This is something you would think that would come out of Paul's mouth. However, this next phrase, but faith working through love, causes some consternation for some people. So, again, in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything. In other words, whether you're circumcised or uncircumcised, it doesn't do much for your salvation. But then he adds these 5 words, but faith working through love. What in the world?
I love that.
I had trouble even understanding what it meant at first, of course.
I don't understand what it means, but I just love the phrase. I like the way it sounds, and it seems right. I mean, when I see circumcision, I think law.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and when I see faith and love, it feels like Christ is the fulfillment.
Okay.
That's because you're that sensor feeler.
But you don't, apparently it sounds pretty to you. It's kind of like the way you pick basketball teams. It's how much you like the uniforms. And
I think basketball is one of the round balls, or
yeah, it's one of the. So the same with this phrase, but faith working through love is. It sounds pretty. Don't know what it means, but it certainly sounds good. So, a couple things. First of all, Dallas has not a lot to say about this particular verse, except that salvation by faith is apart from works, which we've been saying over and over again, which is what the first half of the phrase says. And then he goes on to say that faith is genuine, or the Dallas group goes on to say faith that is genuine does work itself out through love. And then they leave it at that. I think there's a lot more to this particular verse than that, though. Calvin says this, and I love, it seems like to me there's times that Calvin is genius, and then there's times when I wonder what he's thinking, but you'll kind of have to decide on that. Hold on one second here. Okay. One of the things that Calvin says is that there would be no difficulty on this passage were it not for the dishonest manner in which it has been tortured by the papists.
Now, who said that?
Calvin. And so what he's saying here,
Lutherish.
Well, in some ways it does. It seems like I'm getting a lot of background noise from you, Brent. Is that true or not?
We are getting some background noise in here. Yeah, we'll get the kids to be a little quieter.
Okay. Anyways, I'll say it again. Calvin says there would be no difficulty on this passage were it not for the dishonest manner in which it has been tortured by the papists. They take this line, if the faith which justifies us be that, quote, which worketh by love, then faith alone does not justify. That is a Catholic perspective. That what Paul is really saying here is that it's not just faith that justifies, but instead faith working. And Calvin suggests that this language has been tortured and misinterpreted by the Catholics. Calvin goes on to say, I answered, they do not comprehend, and this is pretty interesting, this is an exact quote, my answer to them is that they do not comprehend their own silly talk. Okay? And so
Yeah.
he's very strong in his language, because the point here isn't that it's not that for in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything. In other words, Paul isn't saying works don't mean anything, but faith with works means something. You see how illogical that is.
Right.
He's in the first half of the sentence saying it's the works don't mean anything, the faith does. And this language, but faith working through love, if you construe that to mean that it must be some sort of work that you have to do, well, then we just missed the first half of the phrase, or first half of the sentence. And so this is why Calvin calls this silly talk. And he goes on to say, Paul does not assign any part of justification to love. Love has nothing to do with obtaining righteousness. And this would have been the language of the Catholics, that somehow you have some sort of hurdle of love to jump over in order to obtain righteousness. He's saying, no, that's not the case at all.
Hurdle of love.
What we're talking about here is faith must have something to do with love, but love doesn't create the righteousness that can only come through faith. Luther goes on to say, and so here Calvin says, to try to connect this verse, this love with works, with justification, with righteousness, is silly talk. Luther expands on this and says that faith, after it is justified, is not idle, but exercised, working through love. And so this becomes very clear. And he just gets a little more practical with it, which Luther seems to always do. Faith.
I like the way mine says it.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to. Mine just says through salvation, or though salvation by faith apart from works is by faith apart from works. Faith that is genuine does work itself out through love.
Yeah.
So it's kind of the same. But I like the way it said that.
That's right. We need to be very careful, though, as we're looking at this. Faith, after it has justified, in other words, after it has done its work, then is not idle, but exercised through working through love. Then it works through love. Okay? Which is kind of what you said, Brent. What I want to add to this is no matter how I think one of the things that we've missed the point on at times is an attempt to understand where faith really resides. And I'm not sure that we even think about faith from the perspective of where is it? For instance, faith is not an emotion. Faith is not, you can't say I feel faith. You can't say you do faith. Faith instead resides only in a belief. And yet I don't know that we spend a lot of time thinking about what faith really is. Faith is not a do, and faith is not an emotion. Again, you can't say I feel faith, and you can't say I do faith. But faith is actually a belief. In other words, faith is something that happens in our thought life. It's a belief. And then after this, after it's done its work, then it works. Here we have the actions through love. And so we see in this verse the importance of our thoughts precursoring our actions and the connection between the two. And it would make total sense that if our thoughts are lined up with what's true, with God's truth, and God is love, then out of that is going to be actions that line up with God's love, that line up with how God would love. and we would extend that love in a form of an action to other people. So, for instance, let's be very clear on this. Let's for example, talk about a situation with a husband and a wife. And we're going to look at this right here. Now, one of the things that I've done lately is I've spent a lot of time talking to men. And for whatever reason, there seems to be a significant challenge, and maybe it's just all these men are kind of in that been married for 10 to 20 years type of thing. But there seems to be a significant challenge with men struggling with their wives because the men feel like their wives don't respect them. Okay? Now, I've talked to like 3 guys in the last couple weeks about this particular topic, and it's really creating a lot of challenges for them. Now, there's a book out called Love and Respect or some such thing like that, and I haven't read it, so I don't know much about it.
You don't?
But
I read it.
Yeah,
was it
throw
good?
File 13 it.
Brent says to trash it. What do you say, Lisa? Is it good?
It has elements that are helpful, but for the most part, it's still saying that you'll feel better if someone else is doing something.
Yep.
Yeah.
And if you'll do this for them, they'll do. I'm looking at the book right now.
Oh, you actually have the book in your hand.
Oh, I know. I'm looking at it. I'm just saving it to be able to use for kindling.
Oh,
Oh.
okay. Yeah, I mean, I haven't read the book. I'm not bashing the book. But if the book, or if any resource suggests that, well, in order to have a happy marriage, then the woman needs to respect the man. What it's going to do is it's going to make the man read the book, and the man's going to think, well, my problem is my wife doesn't respect me. And then what's going to happen is the man is going to be upset because the wife's not respecting him. And that anger and resentment for the wife not respecting him is going to cause the wife then to lose trust in the man because the man's going to be upset about it because she's not doing what he wants her to do. And then the wife eventually is going to tell the man that she's not comfortable being around all his anger and resentment. And then the man's going to say, well, I'm not, what are you talking about? If you would respect me, that you see the cycle we get into here. It's a never-ending cycle.
And Derek, I'll be honest with you. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Lisa.
Well, and a good codependent will read the book and try to do everything that the book is saying with the expectation that once they do those things, the other person will start acting differently.
And Lisa, that's what I was getting ready to say when I got that book 5 years ago. I think that probably down deep that was my motivation, and I realized, within a year and a half after that of working with with Derek and stuff, that kind of was my motivation, and because I didn't feel respected, and I said, well, we need to read this book. We've got to figure this thing out, and so yeah, that was kind of my hidden motivation. Not
Yeah,
clean.
me too.
Yeah. So let's attempt to do it a little differently. Let's attempt to do life in a way that looks a little bit more like this, where faith actually, after it's done its work, in other words, after it's justified, then works itself out through love. So what does this look like? Well, this looks very different than this paradigm that the man is upset because the wife doesn't respect him. The wife doesn't respect him. In fact, when I'm talking to a man and he says, well, my problem is my wife doesn't respect me, my question for him is, why do you need your wife to respect you?
Come on, it's biblical.
To be happy. Okay, or you can put whatever in there. To have a happy marriage, to be happy, to feel good about your life, or whatever the issue is, it's causing them problems. So, but here we have a very different solution. This solution says, now wait a second. Instead of trying to get respect from your wife, instead of trying to get justified by your wife, instead of trying to convince yourself that you're good enough from your wife, how about we let faith do that? So if faith justifies, what's really happening here is we're saying, look, if I believe that God is in me and he's justified me and I am righteous, now, guess what? I don't need someone else to respect me to make me feel better about myself. And if I don't need someone else to respect me to feel better about myself, now all of a sudden, instead of resenting my wife, I don't have to resent her anymore. I don't have to try to get her to change. I don't have to shame her into treating me better. Instead, I can be at peace with regardless if she respects me or not. Now here's the big question. If I resent her, is it going to be easier or harder to love her in an active way?
Harder, obviously.
Okay. So love is going to go down if I resent her. But if, look, you don't need to respect me for me to feel good about myself. Now all of a sudden, when my resent goes up here, my love goes down. My resent goes down. Why? Because I'm already justified. Faith has already done its work. Now all of a sudden, instead of trying to get something out of her, get her to respect me, manipulate her to like me more, get her to do what I want her to do, now I can focus on her instead of me. And when I focus on her instead of me, now love can go up. This up here is focusing on me. This is focusing on her. Well, guess what? Faith, when we understand where all of our goodness comes from, faith moves us, right here, to love. It's a beautiful thing. It's exactly what we said back here. Faith, after it has justified, then works through love. Fantastic verse.
See, I told you that phrase is beautiful in and of itself, and there it is.
Because you thought it was pretty. But now we know that it's even more than pretty. It's actually very logical and truth-filled and life-changing.
I love the focus
and pretty.
of the difference between it being a me-focused and a them-focused, because I remember experiencing that directly. Whenever I was focused on me, I was less able to love. When I focused on the other person, for me, I guess it did feel like love, but it really felt like compassion too.
Yeah. Well, that's the key. That is the key. In fact, Luther goes on to say the whole life of a Christian is that, quote, inwardly consists of faith toward God and outwardly in loving action towards others. So, here's how he kind of summarizes it. It's the Christian life is about inwardly an inward faith toward God. And so to make this exactly right, we would do that. So it's an inward faith towards God and an outward love toward others. And we can see how that works in this example that we just gave, in a real practical example. Now, interestingly enough, he even goes a little further. He says, note, this inward faith is where we connect with God. And he makes it, and Luther actually brings up this point. He says, this outward love that we have towards others, God doesn't really need our works of love. He's pretty good. He doesn't need our works of love. But others do need our works of love. Others have a need for our love, but not our faith. God has a need for our faith and not our love. Is how he would say it. Probably a little simplistic, not exactly. I know you could probably twist that in ways that would not make that totally true, but in a generic sense, it's an interesting way of thinking about it. He also clarifies, he also asks, what does faith mean? And he answers it very clearly. Faith means righteousness. Very powerful. That's why faith can work itself out through love. it can work itself out through love, because faith is what gives us that righteousness. It gives us the completeness necessary for us to extend love to other people. When we really understand we're righteous, when we believe, when we have that faith, now we don't have to get the good feeling about ourselves, some sort of rightness about our own life from someone else. So here we have a really cool connection between faith and love. We're going to move on to verse 7 now. Any thoughts on that you want to add, Lisa or Brent or Kathy or whoever else?
Well, it feels to me like
No, I think we're Kathy said no.
Okay. Go ahead, Lisa.
It feels like righteousness is what, well, we say this all the time, but it's really, it's out of the fullness of my righteousness that I can love other people in a way that's clean and without needing anything from them.
Right.
So that inward and outward, it just is a real symbiotic process.
Yeah, absolutely. It's critical that we understand the moment that we lose sight of who God says we are, which is righteous, we are going to try to find it elsewhere. We're going to try to find it somewhere else, like a spouse or a job or our kids or our performance or a date. Anything that we think can fill us up when we've already been filled up is where we're going to go as soon as we lose sight of this gift that God has given to us. Okay, on to verse 7. Here Paul says this, "You were running well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth?" We're going to spend just a little time on this one. First of all, Dallas mentions that the singular pronoun who indicates that who he's talking about here is a leader of the Judaizers was in view, that he was talking about some particular Judaizer. I don't know that could be, you can think what you want to about that, but, singular could also mean a group of people in the singular way. I mean, like you could say there's one group of people as, what one group of people hindered you. So I don't know that we can go there and suggest that it has to be one individual. And it goes on to say that Galatians were attempting to complete the race by legalistic self-effort rather than faith. And so, again, this is nothing new. This is what Paul has been talking about for the last number of chapters. Now, Calvin does some very interesting things here. As we mentioned before, it seemed like Calvin really was on target back here with this silly talk that we talked about. Calvin does something very different with this verse 7. And I find it extraordinarily interesting. He says this, Calvin suggests that verse 7 is Paul's way of bringing the Galatians, and here's the exact words out of his commentary, to a sense of shame. So they return more speedily to the right path. Okay.
I need you to break that down a little more. You were running well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? So are you saying that the hindrance was a return to a sense of shame? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm not saying anything. What I'm saying is that Calvin suggests that Paul is actually communicating this, is using, in his commentary, he suggests that Paul starts into this language because he's trying to shame the Galatians into changing. He says, you were running well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? This is what Calvin is saying. He's saying that this is Paul's way of shaming them. Okay?
Confronting them. Okay.
Now, interestingly enough, I can't even connect the dots here, because here Calvin in verse 6 says, in Christ Jesus neither circumcision or uncircumcision means anything. Your works mean nothing. And in fact, Calvin goes on to say, to think that these works mean anything is silly talk. You loving to try to make something of yourself, to try to get justified, that's just silliness. And then he turns around and suggests that Paul is somehow shaming them into doing something different. Now, you see that it just seems totally illogical to me that Paul would be shaming them to do something different. Now, how can I come up with the word do? Well, because here it is. You're running well. Who hindered you from obeying? And this is the key word that Calvin spends some time on. In fact, he says he specifically uses this particular word. Now, most translations do, but Calvin was probably using Erasmus's Greek translation when he translated the Bible into his commentaries. So he was going back to the Greek. He wasn't using the Latin Vulgate, which came later than the Greek. He wasn't using some, contemporary translation of the time. He was going back to the Greek, and it was probably Erasmus's Greek. And in light of that, he specifically says in his commentary that he believes the word obeying is the word necessary for this particular verse. Most translations do. But again, we seem to be walking on some really slippery, we're on a slippery slope here. Because here, we're suggesting that works can't do it. Down here, there's a Calvinistic interpretation that says, wait a second, I'm going to shame you because you're not obeying. We have a couple different things to notice here. Number one, even though many translations take this word and say it's obeying, who hindered you from obeying? When right up here we're talking about works not justifying. In some ways, doesn't seem to make sense that that word is translated right, or most correctly, we'll say. And so here's how you do this. If you want to figure this out, there's an online source of Strong's Concordance, and I just typed in Strong's Concordance in Google, and this seems to always come to the top, and I click on it. I have no idea who runs this website or anything like that. But what you do is right here where it says Strong's Concordant King James Version, you can just type in the verse. And so we're going to type in Galatians 5 and click search.
That's cool.
Now, can you see this?
Holy cow.
Okay. Now what we're going to do is scroll down to verse 6.
What are all the numbers? What do all the numbers mean?
Okay, yeah. Here, you see all these numbers here. These are Strong's numbers. I'm going to try to make it a little bigger for you. These are what they called Strong's numbers. Now, look, ye did run well. This is the King James Version. Every one of these words has a number, and this number means there is a Greek word associated with this particular word or phrase. For the most part, you see, like down here it says, ye will be. There's a word in the Greek that's been translated into this little tiny phrase, ye will be. For the word obey, it's Strong's number 3982. So we're going to click on that and see what this word really means. Here's the word itself. It's okay, you can even go in here and see the transliteration of that particular Greek word. And he pronounces it for you. It's Python.
Yeah.
Okay?
Huh.
Now, as we scroll down and look at this word, we find a very interesting thing. The biblical usage, the authorized version translation count. In other words, how many times was this word translated into some other word besides obey? Interesting. 22 times it was translated using the word persuade. Yet 7 times it was used, this particular word was translated into the word obey. Okay, now let's go down just a little further here. Let's see, where am I at? I think I'm missing something. Okay. Now, notice as we go up and look at the biblical, the outline of the biblical usage, this word, if we're going to try to come up with what does this mean, it means things like this. hold on, let me try to get something. To persuade, to induce one by words to believe, to be persuaded, to suffer oneself to be persuaded. Again, to believe, to listen to or obey, to trust, have confidence, be confident. Okay? Now, you can certainly take this word and translate it into obey. But notice that to persuade has more to do with a belief than it has to do with something that we do. To be persuaded has something more to do with the way we think. Normally is how we think about the word persuade. I'm going to persuade you would normally mean I'm going to change the way you're thinking. Notice how we also have here to believe. And this word has been translated into believe almost as many times as obey, 6 times as opposed to, or 3 times as opposed to 7. I'm sorry, I was looking at the wrong numbers. So about half the time. So sometimes it is believe, sometimes it's obey, sometimes it's persuade. Most of the time it's been persuade. But notice this, to believe, to be persuaded. You would think this would mean to be persuaded to believe. Why am I spending all this time on this? Well, first of all, because I want you to see how simple it is to be able to go back and check this out right on the internet.
Cool resource.
However, and it's totally free, however, here's the reason why. What if we change the word obeying to believing? You were running well. Who hindered you from believing the truth? Okay?
Yeah.
Now we have a statement that seems to coincide very much with verse 6. We also have a statement that doesn't seem to be disconnected from the logic of the point that Paul's trying to make. Why would Paul say up here, what you do isn't what counts, it's faith? By the way, who hindered you from doing something good? I'm going to shame you into doing something right. See, this doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Now, you can do what you want to with this verse. You can, pick a different definition that you think it makes sense. But what I'm doing here is just communicating that there's a couple different ways of looking at this verse, and it seems to me that it doesn't seem, well, it certainly seems not unreasonable to think that if we put 6 and 7 together, for in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything. What you do does not gain you salvation, does not make you righteous. In fact, that faith that's in you will work itself out through love, but it's not, love isn't what makes you righteous. What you do isn't what makes you righteous. You were running well, but who hindered you from believing the truth? Who hindered you from this faith? Who hindered you from your belief system? Okay?
So he's really nailing the Judaizers here.
Yeah, Paul is.
And at the let me ask you a question. In verse 10, when he talks about, but the one who's upsetting you, whoever he is, will bear the divine judgment. Is he talking about his divine judgment, or is he talking about God's divine judgment?
Yeah.
Or is it basically both?
Yeah, it's interesting. We're going to get to verse 10 here in a second. One way of looking at this, verse 10, the one who is disturbing you will, one way of looking at it, the obvious way of looking at it, is that the person that's communicating this false doctrine will bear his judgment. Okay? Which this is not an uncommon phenomenon. In fact, if you are moving down a path of false doctrine, you will experience some significant pain. For instance, let's say that I decide that, which has certainly happened over the last couple thousand years in different ways, shapes, and forms. Let's say I decide to get up this morning and say, you know what, I really believe the doctrine that lines up with purity is bigamy. And being married to 3 or 4 wives at a time, that's the doctrine I'm going after. Do I believe that it will that I will bear judgment? Absolutely, I do. I believe it will be a painful experience. I think once I go down that path, I will see very clearly that if I thought it was difficult being married to 1 wife, it's going to be 3 times as difficult being married to 3. And so there's no question that there's going to be some significant consequences. All right? So I do think it's going to be a painful thing if we walk down into wrong, false doctrine.
And I think it'll serve you right.
Yeah, that would probably serve me right. Okay, so back to verse 9, or 10. Where am I at? Verse 7. Clear back up to verse 7. It's critical, I think, that we take this verse and look at it a little more deeply. Now, Luther does a couple of things here with it. He has some interesting insights. And one of the most fun is this one. He takes this first phrase, you who were running well. This is very important what Luther is saying here. He takes a little different direction, but it's very cool. He says, you were running well. And then he says, godly people often find that their life seems more like slow creeping than running. But if they remain in sound doctrine and they walk in the Spirit, this should not trouble them, even if they seem to make slow progress. God judges quite differently. For what seems very slow to us runs swiftly in God's sight. This, I think, is a really cool little observation. What runs slow to us runs swiftly in God's sight. What am I talking about here? What I'm talking about is revelation. Luther understood the theology of the cross as being a revelation of the cross, something that God revealed to us. This concept of righteousness is something that has to be revealed to us, and it comes kind of over time, and I think it digs deeper into us over time. And sometimes we can get frustrated and feeling like we're going so slow, or we don't get it, or it's just like we lose it, or I know that God has justified me, but then I go and try to find my justification from my work or something like that. And it's like an incredible
very, very true
insight. He just encourages us and says, wait a second, God doesn't judge us like that. He judges quite differently. And judges here, he doesn't mean like Judgment Day stuff. He means God looks at it differently. For what seems very slow to us runs swiftly in God's sight. And again, what to us is nothing but sorrow, mourning, and death is joy, mirth, and true happiness before God. And so one of the, let me explain this very quickly. Again, I'll read this. To what us is nothing but sorrow, to God is joy. To us, nothing but sorrow. To God is joy. That's supposed to be a J. So what in the world do you mean by this? Well, Luther had this concept of difficulties and challenges in life. He called it, I don't think I've told you guys this before, but he called it a delicious despair. If you're interested in more information about
what a great phrase.
Yeah. And if you're interested in learning more about this, you can check out Alistair McGrath's book called The Theology. I think it's called Luther's Theology of the Cross or Theologia Crucis or something like that. Anyways, in this particular book, he references Luther's understanding of delicious despair. What does he mean by that? Well, he means to man, to us, it would seem like we're living in sorrow. But to God, it's joy. How could he possibly do it? Because this delicious despair is when we are despairing, then it's in that moment that we turn to God. This despair moves us to God. And from Luther's perspective, he says this despair moves us to the righteousness of God that then he reveals to us, and it's beautiful because then we become justified. Now this would be in a regeneration experience. But on a daily basis, the same thing applies to the extent we're already Christians. This delicious despair moves us towards God, moves us back into the arms of God.
Well, it's that
cool insights.
It's that counterintuitive process that the Beatitudes are all over. When you're at the end of your rope, there is more room for God and His rule. All of that. When you've lost what is most dear to you, then you can be embraced by the one most dear to you.
Yeah, that's good insight.
Yep, that's exactly right. The other thing he mentions here is, and Luther's very good about this, and we've talked about this before, but this falling in doctrine does not have human origins. It comes from the devil and is most perilous. Those who, and he goes on to say, those who, we're kind of going into verse 8 at this point, so let me read this first before we continue. Verse 8 says, this persuasion did not come from him who calls you. This persuasion did not come from God. Okay, this is translated with a capital H. Most translations translate this with a capital H because they believe that Paul's referring to God. This persuasion did not come from him who calls you, which would make total sense. The only other person that he could be calling him would be the Judaizer or the Judaizers, which doesn't really make any sense in this particular verse. So what Luther does so well and is constantly does in his writing is he says, now wait a second. This persuasion, this belief. Now look again at this. Okay? Hold on one second.
I am so amazed at all the work that translation entails, Mr. Strong.
Yeah. Look at this. You were running well. Who hindered you? Now, remember, this Greek word can be translated as believing or persuaded, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, this persuasion, see, to obey, 3982. It's pytho. 3988, this persuasion is a similar word. It's called paisamene. Okay? Again, persuasion. Treacherous or deceptive persuasion. It's a different kind of persuasion. Okay? So, you can see how this verse here in verse 6 would make it sense that we would be talking about believing, not obeying here. And then the very next verse reinforces that thought by suggesting that this obeying really should be persuasion or believing. And then Paul goes on to say this persuasion did not come from him. In other words, now let's read it like that. You were running well. Who hindered you from believing the truth? This persuasion, this belief, they persuaded you to believe something that did not come from him who calls you. So you see why I think this word, obeying, gets us into trouble, both before and after this verse. I'm not going to beat that dead horse any longer, but I think it's critically important because this really gets screwed up. I mean, all of a sudden it's just like, yeah, well, it's about our belief, and then now we've got to go obey and do something to feel good, and then we're back to believing. You know, it can be confusing, and I think it's critical that we point that out. Now, this persuasion did not come from you. Falling in doctrine does not have human origins, Luther says. It comes from the devil and is most perilous. Now, let's go ahead down one more. Okay, here it is. The devil is wonderfully persuasive and knows how to amplify the least sin. Why in the world is he saying this in this context? Well, the reason is because when we are justified by faith, we'll go back here. When we are justified by faith, faith means we are righteous, okay? That we are good enough without anybody else completing us. All that makes total sense. So what's the first thing the devil's going to do? The devil's going to come in and say what?
We're not righteous. That you're
not
You need
righteous.
something else to be complete.
Right.
Exactly. So what Luther says is the devil is wonderfully persuasive and knows how to amplify the least sin. What does he mean? He means if the devil can amplify your sin, then he can convince you, no, you're not really righteous. Look how much you sinned today. And then Luther goes on to say, here the troubled conscience must be comforted. This idea, this troubled conscience that comes from this amplification of sin that causes you to believe, oh no, you're not really righteous. It's not, you can't be righteous. Look, you sinned today. This idea does not come from Christ. And that's how he extends his doctrine of justification into this particular verse. It's quite interesting. I love one of the things that Luther does, and we've done before, but Luther actually loves to play the devil's advocate. He loves to take and imagine what the devil is saying to him so he can turn around and fight him back. And you can imagine that Luther was like used to this. It was almost like Luther many times felt like the devil was talking audibly to him. Now, I'm not suggesting that in reality, but there was a sense that Luther was like, he's talking nonsense to me.
Well, I think he had such a, he was such a logical thinker that he was always giving the counter argument. And I think the spirit life within him was so active that he could sense when those arrows, were coming at him that were not in tune with the spirit life.
Right.
And I'm guessing he was also an extrovert, and he just was always processing out loud and through his writing and
Yeah.
to figure things out.
Yeah, I can't disagree with any of that. And in fact, Luther goes on to say, and he starts playing the devil now. He says, but Satan is a skillful workman and will leave no way untried. He may overthrow this assurance and lay against you the word and example of Christ. Overthrow this word of justification. Overthrow this word of righteousness. Now, and so what Luther does is he says this. It's like the devil. This is what the devil would say. This is how Luther's talking. This is what the devil would say. It is true that Christ is meek, gentle, merciful, but only to those who are holy and righteous. To sinners, he threatens wrath and destruction. Remember, I'm talking like Satan now. He pronounces that unbelievers are already damned. Moreover, Christ did many good deeds. He also suffered many evils and commands us to follow his example. But your life is not according to Christ's word or his example. You are a sinner, and there is no faith in you. You have done no good at all, and therefore those sentences that set Christ forth as a severe judge apply to you, and not the comforting sentences, and not the comforting sentences that show him as a loving and merciful Savior. Now,
you're good, Satan.
Yeah, so I'm trying to act like Satan there.
You're doing good.
Luther also, then he goes on to say, if Satan says this to you, then here's what you say. Scripture presents Christ as a gift, and I take hold of him in this way, in this gift. I can lack nothing, for in him are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Therefore, even though I have committed many grievous sins, they will still, if I believe in him, be swallowed up by his righteousness. Powerful, powerful stuff. I love how Luther explains this, and how the dog likes it too. Okay, so we have some really, I guess, very interesting insights into some of these verses by these guys. I'm going to skip over that section. Hold on one second. All right, let's go ahead on to verse. There's a couple other things that are interesting there, but let's go ahead on to verse 9. And we'll probably wrap up with verse 9 tonight. Verse 9, Dallas Theological Seminary, in their commentary, suggests that Paul must have been thinking that other people were thinking, like the Galatians, for instance, that Paul was making too big of a deal out of this. That this whole circumcision, uncircumcision thing, that the Galatians must have been saying, what is the big deal? It's not that big a deal. People have been circumcised for thousands of years, hundreds of years, thousands of years. What is the big deal? Or he may have known that the Judaizers were using this argument against the Galatians. They were using an argument like this. Hey, Galatians, what is the big deal? Paul's making such a huge deal out of this. This is not that big a deal. Stop. Just get circumcised and be done with it. It doesn't matter that it's not a big deal. This would be a tactic that someone might use in order to try to get you to believe their way of thinking. And so that's why Dallas says, lest someone feel that Paul was making too much of the problem, he quoted a proverb of yeast. Now, we don't exactly know, I don't know exactly where this proverb came from. A little leaven leavens the whole lump of dough. But, one might surmise that this was not an uncommon, obviously the concept of leaven and unleaven was clearly a concept that Jews would have been very familiar with in light of their festivals. So who knows? This might have been some language that Paul grew up with. Even if the false doctrine only affected a few, be on the guard because it could affect the whole church, is what Dallas suggests. He goes on to say, it also could mean that one small deviation from the truth could destroy the entire system. Now, this is interesting. What is being said here is the possibility that if we have one small deviation, it could lead to the destruction of the whole system.
Well, it's like one lie can just start piling up.
Correct. And then they give the example. If circumcision were made necessary for salvation, then the whole system of grace would fail. Now, Calvin mentions this. He suggests that this yeast proverb is regarding doctrine and not man. In other words, in this particular case, what Paul is saying is a little leaven leavens the whole lump of dough. What he's suggesting is that he's talking about this little deviation in doctrine is causing it, not the deviation of the Judaizers. He's not saying the Judaizers are causing the whole problem. They're running rampant. You know, like one little Judaizer could create a massive problem for the whole church. He's saying that's not really what's going on here. However, although we're not going to get into it tonight, it does remind me of, in fact, yesterday or a couple of days ago, or whenever I was kind of looking through these verses, I started thinking, it seems like Paul talks about this proverb somewhere else in Scripture that I've heard before, and he does. It's in 1 Corinthians 5 where he talks about restoring the guy who had committed incest. And there, it looks like he does use the language of this leaven. A little yeast can screw up the whole church, so to speak. It infiltrates the whole dough. Now, I'm not going to get into that this evening, but be aware that that's a case that could be interpreted as it being related to man. Here, we're suggesting it relates to doctrine. I happen to believe that Paul also is talking about doctrine in 1 Corinthians 5, but some would argue differently. And finally, Luther has a couple things to say about this. He's suggesting that the Galatians and the Judaizers are asking him to wink at it. In other words, they're asking Paul to just kind of wink at this whole circumcision thing. It's not that big a deal. And then Paul answers by saying that a little yeast makes the whole batch of dough sour. In philosophy, and this is how Luther explains it, and this is totally in line with Calvin. Again, Calvin is suggesting that a small deviation could lead to the destruction of the whole system. Luther also suggests something very similar by saying that in philosophy, in thought life, a small fault in the beginning is a great and foul fault in the end. So it is in theology. And so here Luther first suggests that when you start on the wrong path in theology, it can lead to some really ugly paths down the line. So it is, would Calvin and Luther say. So it would be with some of the wrong starts that occurred in Roman Catholicism. A wrong start in the doctrine of purgatory. A wrong start in the doctrine of penance, where Luther would suggest that the Roman Catholics interpreted the verse "be penitent" incorrectly, and suggested that the Roman Catholics interpreted the "be penitent" as "do penance," but it was interpreted wrong. And so if you interpret the word "be penitent" as "do penance," now you've started in a wrong theology that ultimately can lead to a massive breakdown in the whole system.
Yeah, it's a huge difference.
Okay? So this would be the kind of thing that Luther was probably thinking of when he was thinking of this wrong theology, because he also, of course, wrote about this penance concept being misinterpreted by the Roman Catholic Church. And he would have said that this... Go ahead, Lisa.
I just wonder if that's why Christ used parables so much, is to really highlight, you're going down this path, but look at this in the context of a story. Do you see the big picture that can be played out here in a way that they could relate to it?
Yeah.
To see what would happen in the ultimate ending of it.
Yeah, I mean, that would make sense. And in fact, it's a good transition into our final look at this yeast concept, which is Luther takes us to Luke chapter 11. He says, a small speck of dust in the eye harms the eye. As Christ says, your eye is the lamp of your body. When your eyes are good, your whole body is full of light. But when they are bad, your body also is full of darkness. If your whole body is full of light and no part of it dark, it will be completely lighted. By this allegory, Christ indicates that the eye, that is, doctrine, ought to be most simple, clear, and sincere, having in it no darkness, no cloud. So now, imagine, what he does is he connects this concept of this yeast into creating the whole batch of dough being sour. He connects it to this allegory of, imagine a piece of dirt in your eye and how it would block your vision of being able to see reality and to see truth. He would say it's kind of like that. And when your vision is blocked from the truth, then it becomes very dark. But it's not a lot. It doesn't take much of a speck to significantly cause you not to be able to physically see. And it doesn't take much of a speck for you to be able to live in that darkness. And so now as we read these verses, the eye is the lamp of your body. When your eye is clear, your whole body also is full of light. But when it is bad, your body is full of darkness. Watch out that the light in you is not darkness. If therefore your whole body is full of light with no dark part in it, it will be wholly illumined, as when the lamp illumines you with its rays. Let's see what the Message says about this, and we'll end with that.
It just makes me think of what's going on currently with the whole end of the world doctrine and, what we would think of as false prophets, etc. It's like one belief system that's gone awry can start this whole crazy process.
Right. He says, your eye is a lamp lighting up your whole body. If you live wide-eyed in wonder and belief, your body fills up with light. If you live squinty-eyed in greed and distrust, your body is a dank cellar.
Nice.
Very poetic. Okay?
Wowza.
All right, we'll end right there. Anything to add from anybody? I don't know if Kathy's still with us or not. I muted her for a little while because I knew there was some background noise. But
Well, she also talked through my mic.
Oh, okay, that's right. Her mic is problematic. Okay, anything to add, Lisa?
I think it's just really helpful. Again, it seems to me like we just hit on several things that reinforce life's transforming practical application.
Sure.
Which, is good.
Brent?
I jumped ahead there because I was really studying ahead when we were talking, going to that verse 10 about the divine judgment thing. But as I'm looking, without going to that verse, just what we've gone through now, how adamant Paul is about not mixing grace with works. And even though I kept looking at that verse 10 because I'm thinking, he says, bearing the divine judgment. And we've talked before about what's really the only reason why someone is to be put out of the church is for false teaching, for heresy. And I look at this whole thing and think, holy smokes. Again, anything who is preaching grace plus anything else is guilty of heresy. And it's kind of an unsettling thing to think about how much of that we hear.
Yeah. Yeah, that's certainly what it seems like Paul is saying very clearly. Kathy, do you have anything else to add? I know you might have to change headphones. But.
I love that obedience perspective and persuasion and understanding that that's about belief and part about light in your eye. And I don't think about that's important.
Yeah, what Kathy just said, I think, is that this concept of obedience and understanding exactly what that means and what it could mean is critical, and as well as this understanding of the light and the darkness that comes just with, when we start that wrong theology, it doesn't take much to cause us to head in a really ugly direction. So,
Yeah.
Good. Thanks for that, Kathy. Lisa, will you pray and we'll be done?
Sure. Father, thank you for this time tonight. Thank you for your ongoing process of revelation. May we continue to understand that it is indeed a process, and that what seems tedious to us is swift for you because of revelation. Thank you how you keep driving home the truth of righteousness and driving home the truth of how you love us, and that it's about love. It's not about us doing things for you, but it indeed is about your love for us. Thank you for this evening. Amen.
Amen.